Hi, I'm Tracy Soltis, your leading health and nutrition coach and molecular biologist. I've consulted with hundreds of people around the world on their human journey. So if you're a seeker looking for answers, information and knowledge, you'll find it here. Come on a journey with me as I explore the science, the physical body, and the cognitive and energetic space of what it really means to be human. All right, welcome back everyone. I'm so excited to have you guys listening in today. I've got a very special guest with me, Jason Bart. Jason is a transformational coach in Perth, Western Australia. His areas of focus are to empower men to own their magnificence, to release trauma in women around men. Jason has been deep diving into what it means to walk this earth with passion and grace for well over a decade now. Strongly influenced by his work with Sacred Sexuality and Tantra and also Gene Keys, he has developed a unique ability to turn in and tune in to what is moving energetically in the body and witness without judgment some of the stories that are playing out in the mind. Jason is available for one-on-one intuitive sessions that incorporate a wide variety of modalities to help shine a light on what wants to stay hidden within. He also facilitates a range of workshops and gatherings designed to empower our truth and foster our ability to share this with grace. Amazing. Today I'm going to be chatting with Jason about vulnerability, the alpha male journey, and how this impacts mental health. Welcome, Jason.
Thank you, Trace.
How are you doing today?
Really good, really good.
And I know I've been super excited to get to our chat because this month it's all about men's health month for November. And so I'm really excited to get you on board because I can talk about men's health, but I'm not in a man's body. And so it's kind of pointless for me. I'm not experiencing what you're experiencing. And so I would love to hear from you. Like, let's start right from the beginning. Like, what led you to this point that you're in right now?
Well, it's often a catalytic moment for people, and for me it was the same. There was a specific moment I can remember where I had been married for about 10 years and things were starting to come to a separation in that. And my wife at the time was actually away in Holland, and I was tuning into actually my inner flame, and I was feeling into that, and I'd been, the father, I'd been the provider, I'd been the protector, I'd been, the dad of the house.
Yeah.
But I'd lost who Jason was.
Yeah.
And I remember specifically going into a meditation and looking for this inner flame, and it was like there was a bonfire the night before and there was just like a pile of ashes.
Wow.
And I remember like pushing the ashes away and seeing these glowing embers still, and just getting little bits of kindling in my mind's eye and putting it on there and blowing on my flame. And I vowed to never let go of that inner flame again. Yeah. And that then took me into a pathway and luckily enough, I was surrounded by people in Tantra. And for me, what was really empowering about that was everything is possible. And it was down to my boundaries, down to my choices. And prior to that, I'd been very much in a place of a people pleaser and I'll do whatever, happy wife, happy life kind of scenario.
Yeah.
And this really is what brought me into choosing for me and bringing that back. And it was a pretty ugly journey for a while, but that's what happens when you go through the shadow, right?
Yeah. And I felt really emotional when you started talking about how you felt like it had been a bonfire for you, like your flame had been huge. Like when I think of a bonfire, I think of this like magnificent, huge like energy and glow and, spark of life. And then to feel as though that had dwindled and you'd lost that kind of drive and that energy, that life force. Did you notice that along your journey that it had started to kind of go down?
Not really. I think it was one of those really slow boil type of scenarios, where you just, I was happy. I was doing my thing, but we'd moved away in the relationship. And I think this happens a lot. And we were talking about it a little bit before recording of losing that polarity, you know. And my wife and I, we were great managers of the business of our family.
Yes.
But the dynamic of being in partnership had definitely dwindled. And through that, you know, just giving up myself more and more to make everything around me happy, I didn't really notice it until I looked for it.
And that's a really interesting thing that you just said there, giving up, because I feel as though what I see, and look, I'm just going to put a little disclaimer out there that this conversation could be triggering for some people because it is quite a hot topic when we are talking about the dynamics between men and women in relationships. And I think that men go unnoticed in a lot of areas so that they become dads, they get married, they become fathers, they're the husband, they're the provider, and their needs necessarily, they kind of get put to the sideline. And, you know, there is a lot more information out there for women these days than there is for men. And so we've lost some of that kind of importance around how important it is for men to also have access to different services and self-care and looking after themselves and knowing that they're important in a relationship but also in a community as well. Would you?
Yeah, 100%. And it's also how we get recognized. You know, men get recognized for their achievements.
Yeah.
Right. And I really recognized that growing up. And the recognition I got from my dad was, you know, if I got an A or if I got best player, then it was like, my son is amazing. But if I was feeling emotional, then it was just like, you know, go to your room kind of thing, right? We aren't, especially in Australia, being a young man in Australia, it's you're not allowed to be vulnerable.
Yes.
Right? Especially growing up in the 70s and the 80s when I was growing up. There was no permission to be vulnerable at all.
So let's talk a little bit about that. Like, what is vulnerability for men, from a man's perspective?
Well, I don't know if it's different for men or women, but the vulnerability is to really feel what is authentically going on in the body and then to be able to express that without, you know, needing validation from the outside. Mm-hmm. Because for a lot of men, and this is where the alpha part comes straight into it, right? Because as soon as you are a man and there is another man in the room, there is a primal thing that is happening around who is the alpha in this room.
Yeah, interesting.
Right?
Yeah.
And so as soon as you show vulnerability, then you're submissive and the other person has an ease in becoming the alpha and having the power over dynamic because you showed vulnerability.
Yeah, right. Whereas when we should really be empowering all people, right, to stand within themselves, and if they're all alpha, great, they're all alpha.
Exactly, and that is the big shift, and some of the work that I've been doing with men is shifting the alpha dynamic from a competitive thing to an internal thing of what does your inner alpha look like, and can you stand, and all men stand in their own personal alpha dynamic, and then within the room there is still always going to be a stronger personality than another. And that is just a natural hierarchy that happens, whether it's men or women or business, that there is always different people have different roles and that is our nature. Yeah. So there's nothing wrong with that, but it's when we don't own our own alpha and speak our own truth and be vulnerable in that.
Yeah, and let's actually touch on that a little bit more because I think there's a difference between ego and owning truth because I think sometimes the two get confused where, you know, if someone has an opinion or voices something that comes from their truth, sometimes it can be labelled as, oh, that person's got a big ego or something like that. And so is that something that you see as well playing out?
Yeah, I mean, I think the difference is me speaking my truth and me needing to be right.
Yeah, okay.
Right?
Yes.
Because I want to win this argument is ego.
Yeah.
And me speaking my truth, whether you agree or not, is irrelevant. That's vulnerability. That's inner strength. And that doesn't require any acknowledgement or validation or acceptance from the surroundings, whereas the ego does. The ego's always looking for validation and that posturing of how can I become higher in the status by what I say or how I act in my surroundings. And that's what the ego is looking for. The ego is always looking for a strong place in status.
And so what's your tips for men, like as far as owning their truth and being vulnerable? Like, how can, because I think it's really hard, like I think men have been almost pushed into a corner in some spaces where if they do say an opinion or if they are owning their truth, it can upset someone or, it can be a comment that other people can be offended by and things like that when that's not the intention behind it at all. It's actually just to own their truth and to actually be able to communicate how they're feeling. And look, this plays out in my own relationship sometimes as well. Like Drew and I will have a discussion about something. I say discussion. Let's just be real. We have an argument about something. Yeah. And like he'll say something, can I get offended? But then I'm like, hang on a second. He's just saying how he feels, and I think something you said before about anger, it's become such a negative thing for men to show anger, right? Whereas, that's one of the very primal emotions that comes up for people is anger. Anger, fear, happiness. They're all the basic kind of emotions that we feel. And there's so many messages out there for men, and don't be angry, or the headlines of angry young men, blah, blah, blah. Yeah. It's like, well, hang on. Aren't they allowed to be angry?
Yeah. I think this is where like bringing it through with grace comes in, because when I'm feeling angry, and I feel that energy inside of me, there are different ways that I can express that. And I can express it in a tone that is very clear that I am highly agitated right now and my body is needing to move that.
Yeah.
And I can express that still with grace in a way that it can be received.
Yeah.
But if it builds up to a point where there's just rage and explosion and I am releasing without any idea of what's happening in response to that, that's when, anger turns into violence and aggression and things like that. And there's a difference between anger and violence or anger and aggression. Like anger is an energy, aggression is an action.
Yes. And do you feel like you've got lots of angry men coming to your groups because they're suppressing the anger that they're feeling with life?
Both of those. I think, to be honest, just about everyone on the planet right now is pretty angry. And it's just, do we have permission to be able to feel our anger, and do we know how to be able to release that anger in ways that are safe?
Yeah.
And, emotional release tools are probably one of the greatest gifts that I've had, where beating on a pillow to the point where I'm completely exhausted and my face is full of tears because of the sadness that's often underneath all of the anger, but I'm able to release it. And that's what's hard, because if we keep bottling it up and we put more and more pressure inside the cooker, all of a sudden it's going to explode, and then we don't know how it gets released. But if we can release the pressure, then we're not going to be explosive in our responses. We can actually just very calmly say, this is not okay with me right now, and I'm going to take an action that's going to either remove me or shift the situation. I'm in that power. I have that choice.
Yeah. And so vulnerability is in those terms of what are some of the other things that come up for men when in a vulnerable type space?
Well, vulnerability is everything. Vulnerability is, like I said, expressing your emotion, like being able to tune into exactly what's going on and then being able to share that, express that, let that vibrate inside your body, right? Yeah. And so that can be sadness, that can be anger, but it can be happiness and joy and beauty. So when you're with your beloved, if you're not able to tune into your vulnerability of your anger, you're also not able to tune into your vulnerability of your beauty and your love for your beloved. So everything just becomes protected and shielded from emotion.
Yeah. And I love that, that shielding kind of that word to describe it, because I feel like that's what happens, is that there is a general shield that comes up over men. And so and I'm speaking on behalf of men, I can't do that, but a generalization of what I see in my clinic is that sometimes I have to ask hard questions to really get that shield to drop so that I can really see what's going on underneath, you know, like there's pain and there's sadness and there's happiness and joy and there's feelings of not being heard and there's anger and there's all sorts of things, but men are operating in such a protected space all the time. Yeah. They're not able to be vulnerable and let that out. Is that something that you...
Yeah, like one of the things that comes up a lot with the guys that I work with is that they are so scared of their own anger that they don't want to go there because they don't know what will happen if they do go there. And the last time they went there, something bad happened.
Okay. Yeah. So let's talk about that. Like, I'd love to know some examples of that. So because if there's people that are listening and these are something that they're going through, maybe they can touch base with you and they can reach out or they can get support that they need. So that, I mean, the whole motivation behind this sort of chat is to really encourage men to seek, you know, other men who have been through this, have lived through this. They know that there's support out there and they can, you know, tap into that. So give me some examples of what you see with the people that you work with.
When you say what do I see in what they're needing, or
what are they going through?
Yeah,
and how have bad things happened in the past? Right. And
so I mean, one of the main things is like violence, right? Because when anger comes up and anger gets met by anger, then it can easily turn into violence. Because what is really powerful, and you were asking before about like what helps the most when things like this happen, is being heard, right? So when a guy can be deeply expressive in his anger, and I can stand there and just go fair enough and hold it and watch it and witness it without reacting and responding and bringing like force back to that, then they can empty the cup, right? Yeah. But generally what happens is if I get agitated, and this is where the alpha primal stuff comes in, is that the other person then goes, okay, there's anger here. There is violence potential. I need to get my warrior on. And all of a sudden, two angry, unhealthy warriors start to meet each other and violence happens. Yeah. Right? Or, you know, they feel so repressed in what they're able to express because, you know, when we're talking about relating with women, for example, in a relationship kind of dynamic, and it's not intentional, but most people are very immature in their masculine and in their feminine, right? And so sometimes a man can be sitting there and receive bucket loads of emotional and psychological abuse. And he sits there and it just builds and builds and builds to the point where the only thing that he feels like he can do is to physically respond. Yeah. And then as soon as he physically responds, then all of the blame is put onto that. And now I'm not in any way condoning violence to anyone in any way. Yeah, for sure. But these are responses that happen. These are triggers that happen. And so people hide the emotion because they don't want that to happen. Yeah. They don't want to be violent to their beloved. They don't want to harm them in any way. Yeah. But they don't know any other way to respond right now. And this is that fight or flight response where I'm backed into a corner and I need to get out of this corner. And the only way I can get out is through. Yes. Yeah. And I think that raises a really good point, is that we have this understanding that men holding the masculine can kind of take, you know, a lot of information that's being delivered at them, you know, at a pace that they probably can't. I mean, you know, as women, because we're more, we do tap into our emotions so easily and we are able to be more vulnerable and open with those. I mean, poor Drew sees me cry all the time, you know, like I get it all out. Yeah. But that's because the feminine comes out, but for men, they're holding space all the time. And, of course, the words that are thrown at them and the actions that are thrown at them are still affecting them. They're just not showing it on the exterior. And like you said, those sorts of things, it builds up over time. It builds and it builds and it builds. And these men have no way of releasing that. They've just got this cup full of feeling as though they're failing, feeling as though, like, you know, resentment and all. I'm speaking on behalf of men again, but this is what I see here, is
those feelings of I'm failing as a man and I've got no release. I've got nowhere to like empty my cup because no one's hearing me. No one's seeing, no one's feeling what I'm feeling.
Yeah. And the sad thing is that a lot of men are feeling that.
Yeah.
And so this is part of the thing that I do. I create these gatherings that are free on a Monday night at Waterman's Bay. If anyone's around, you're welcome to just join us to know that you're not alone with that. Yeah. And nobody really gets taught tools on how to express emotions in a healthy way so that it doesn't impact others, but at the same time we get to release that strain that we're holding. Yeah. And, you know, one of the great tools that I can just share just for a moment is give yourself a few moments, right? Like set a timer for 10 minutes or burn a candle or something like that. Give yourself permission for 10 minutes to be as angry as you feel you need to be, to let it all out, knowing that after 10 minutes, you're just going to stop and release and just take a breath and let that part go.
Yeah. And like, what are some of the, you were talking about before about the pillow punching, because like I want to go back to that sound, the
breath, sound and movement.
Exactly. And how therapeutic that is to actually, you know, tap into your inner self, your energetic self. And I talk a lot about, you know, humans being broken down into the physical body, the cognitive body and the energetic body, and how when one area is you know, trying to tap in and communicate with you, it can affect the other two areas. And so when things aren't in balance, we start having issues. So when the energetic body is not being met, we start getting physical ailments, we start getting negative thoughts. You know, it's all connected.
And it really is.
And so we have to stop and we have to turn inward. Like we can't externalize things onto other people and to other situations. We actually have to take responsibility and accountability for how we are and how we are feeling and what's going on with us, so that if we need to call time out, we need to call a break, we do that before it accelerates to a point where there's no recovery from that, not just for other people, but for ourselves. It's so detrimental to our own physical being by not listening and tapping into that inward space. And so what are some of the, I guess, the warning signs? Like, what are some of the things that men who might be listening now can kind of, you know, go, oh, that's actually happening to me, or, you know, those are the things that I'm feeling. So maybe I should, you know, seek this out and touch base with you. Yeah.
So I think, you know, disassociation is one of the key things as well, where you just become numb to what's going on. You become numb to when things that you know are kind of agitating you, and it's not that you're letting it pass through and you're not being affected by it. You're actually in complete denial that it's almost even happening. But what's happening on the inside is it's just layer on layer, and it's almost like this mental thing of, I deserve to be punished, right? That happens. And there is so much man-hating going on in the world out there, that a lot of men do feel like they deserve to be punished for everything that's happened in the past.
Yeah.
And the reality is, like, we are human individuals with our own emotions, our own feelings, and they need to be honored dynamically in the moment, right? So if you feel like you need to take the burden of all men's pain from all centuries past, it's not true, right? Yeah. Of course, that's going to be carrying through in our psyche and the social energies, but we really want to own where we are right now. And so if you're feeling completely disassociated, or if you feel like the little things can just trigger you to another point of like being agitated, then obviously like you're at that boiling point, and every little straw is going to break the camel's back.
Yeah, definitely. Let's talk about mental health and the impacts of these sort of situations, and how men not being able to be vulnerable and show all sorts of emotions, how that's impacting their mental health as well. What's your experience with that?
It's huge. I mean, I don't think there are many greater crises on the planet right now than men's mental health.
And we know that suicide rates in men are significantly high. I mean,
Yeah.
it's in the top 10 of death rates in Australia. So
Yeah.
we know that this is not something that's minor by any means. We know that it's really serious and important. So, like, what are some of the impacts of that you see?
Isolation. Like, people feel like they are alone. You were talking about this before, that there is, and for many men, there is no circle for them to be heard.
Yep.
I remember I was doing men's gatherings in my living room on a Wednesday night. This is probably 10 years ago.
Yep.
And I had a man come in, he was in his 60s. He told us a story that happened in the high school change rooms, and he had never ever told anyone that story, and it's impacted all of his relating.
Yeah.
I mean, that is just one small piece in his mind that's had a huge influence. But as men, and especially, I'm going to say it again, Australian men, where, the macho Australian man who's just, tough and rugged and doesn't feel anything, and then kind of the snag, the sensitive new age guy came through in the 80s and things like that. But there's no container for a healthy, strong king in our environment, and that's really hard. It's really hard.
Yeah.
Because men need role models, and there aren't many solid, clean, authentic role models that we can see in our world, because most of the men that we see and put on pedestals are either huge corporate figures or sporting heroes and things like that. There aren't many men that are a hero in our minds that are, vulnerable, authentic, real, dynamic men.
Owning their shit, really.
Yeah.
Yeah. Like just being themselves in a really beautiful, respected way.
Yeah.
You're right. That I can't think of any that apart from yourself, obviously.
I mean, there are men out there, and, I've got some role models that have been mentors for me, and also other men out in the world that I go, that's a man that I can use as a North Star. Like, that's what I want to walk towards as my role as a man.
Yeah. And so how can us as women, how can we support our men better, do you think? What some of the things now I'm just going to reflect on a little story that Drew told me just recently, is that because he went to a workshop a couple of weeks ago, and with other men, it was just a men's workshop, and it was like, oh, awesome. Like, because I love it when he does this stuff, because, other listeners who have heard before know that, women, we need to speak with other women, men need to speak with men. Like, we are very different in the way that we communicate, and it's great for guys to speak to guys. And so one of the things that I said, when he got home, I was like, so how was it? What did you get from it? Blah, blah, blah. And he was like, oh, yeah, it was okay. The thing I found was that the men in the circle, the majority of the men, their partners, predominantly women, didn't want them to be there. They didn't want them to, they felt like that was time they were taking away from their family. That was time that they were neglecting their responsibilities. I was like really disheartened by that, because I thought these are men that are actually showing up to do a workshop and work on themselves. How does that make any sense, And I found that really distressing, because I thought these are men that have gone to a men's workshop and their partners have gone, oh, why are you doing that for? Like, you should be at home doing all of these things. Like, but they're working on themselves.
Yeah.
Do you see?
I see that a lot,
Yeah.
and one of the kind of rhetorics you see or hear is like, where are all the good men?
Yeah.
There are plenty of good men.
Yeah.
It's just they might not look like you think they're supposed to look. A good man is someone who's honouring their truth and someone who's standing and walking their path. And if that doesn't suit you, that's fine.
Yeah.
But still acknowledge that man for owning his truth. And that's what's powerful, someone who's honouring that inner flame. So what I would say to the women listening, look at your man and see when he is honouring himself and validate that.
Yeah.
when he's making choices to empower his truth and speak to his truth, hear it. Don't fight against it, but just actually try and hear where that's coming from.
Yeah.
And, validation is one of the biggest things for men, to go, I hear you, I trust you, is huge.
Yeah.
Really huge.
Yeah, and respect, right? It's another big one as well, is that, respect when a man talks, listening, because men aren't big communicators. So when they want to say something, it's because it usually has importance behind it, right?
Yeah.
So it's things I'm learning now that obviously I'm married, and it's taken time for me to learn these things too, because I've had a shitload of information put into my head through the course of my whole life too. And it's difficult sometimes to navigate that, because I think as women we've been told certain messages, and we've been the whole feminist movement and things, and what's happened is we've got so much competing between these two roles, and women thinking they have to do everything, and men kind of taking a back seat and going, well, if that makes her happy, let her do it, sort of thing. It's not they're lazy, it's just that they think you're happy doing all of the things, but really if you give them a bit of time, they'll step up to it as well. There's all these mixed messages around the whole dynamic, right, of relationships, which I feel is a whole other topic for us to cover. But yeah, I feel like what you just said before is empowering our men, because that to me is so important. Not, the putting down and the encouraging them. If they show interest in working on themselves, oh my gosh, that's awesome. We want strong, healthy role models in the world to make examples for our children. Wouldn't you?
I agree 100%. And, there are so many things in our environment that make it difficult for men to stand in their truth. A lot of men, what they want is to kind of live their passion, right? They want to ignite that fire within them and then let that burn however that burns in the world. But because of our role as the provider in the society that we live, a lot of people are doing jobs because it pays the bills, not because it inspires them. And if you're not inspired by who you are yourself as a man, then it's really hard to stand in your truth, because you're not walking your truth. Yeah. You're just doing the things you need to do so that you can survive in society. Yeah. And that's what makes it really hard for a lot of men as well, because they're doing the things, and for some of the men, they're doing the things that they actually hate to do. We live in Western Australia with FIFO, and, speak to anyone who's doing that and ask the men if they like what they're doing. 90% of the men will go, I hate it, but it gets me what I need.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. And that's really, it's heartbreaking, because there's so many people out there that have purpose and potential, but they're just not able to become the people that they want to be. Yeah. And they're held back.
They are. And it's frustrating, and it is also just where it is. But, it's a tough choice. Yeah. And who knows, maybe with what's going on in the world, this collapse might actually help us to step more into our authenticity of what is it that we actually want, Yeah. I've been talking about this for a while, long before, where we are now. But as technology evolves and power becomes freely available and food becomes easily available and water and all of those things, if we don't need to pay for power, for example, that's all of a sudden 80% off of the cost of everything. Yeah. So then we don't need to work as much, right? Yeah. And a lot of the blue-collar works and things like that could be done by robotics, right? Yeah. So then it's a case of, what do you want to do in the world? And this is going to be the greatest existential crisis of humanity in the coming years of, all right, with where we are, what do I want to do? Not what can I do or what should I do, but what's alive in me and inspires me to actually step into my power.
Yes, and you raise a really good point, because that's really difficult for people to work out. A lot of people have absolutely no idea.
No idea.
Because they've never given themselves the time to sit with that and go, it's uncomfortable. It's really uncomfortable for people. I had that
when when I went in and I found this bonfire that had gone out, I was so confused who I was as like I didn't even know what my favorite ice cream flavor was.
Yeah, wow, yep.
Right?
Yep.
And I had some ideas, but it truly was.
What is it, by the way?
It's dark chocolate.
Oh, yum. Okay.
Yeah. But my favorite chocolate back then was based on who I was with and what I thought they would like. And then are they more of like a yogurt kind of, or a sorbet or a rich one? And I'm going to try and pick something that is then going to be the same.
Pleasing.
Yeah.
It's like that
it's
pleasing
all about
thing,
people pleasing.
right down to the very core of who you are.
Yeah.
Like that example of just ice cream flavors, trying to make someone happy by making sure that your facility.
Isn't it?
It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah.
But that's where a lot of men are at.
Yeah.
Is that they don't know the answers to these questions, but there's an evolution of this coming, because the more and more men I see, the more and more questions they have, because they sit in this seat and they're here for a reason. They end up here with me for a reason. It's because they've looked at everything else. They don't know what's going on, and so they don't know their purpose. They're doing jobs they hate, like you said before. They're dealing with stuff they don't want to. They're arguing with people at home. They don't know their purpose.
No. And, this is when we're not taught how to communicate, then things just escalate so quickly to the point where there's confrontation, whether it's at work, at home, on the sports field. It doesn't matter. Like there's just that agitation because we're not taught how to communicate. It's really sad.
We're not taught how to argue or negotiate either, or what good, healthy arguing looks like. I mean, it takes a long time. I mean, Drew and I, like we've had our share of going through counselling and stuff to work that out, because it always comes back to communication.
It does.
We don't not love each other when we end up in those spots. We love each other so much. Like I talk to him all the time. I'm like, I knew you in a past life, blah, blah, blah. Like we've been through this before. Like clearly our souls have like connected. Like we're solid, but we end up in those spaces because we don't know how to communicate. That's what it always comes back to. There's a cross wiring there and an uncertainty of like, or people pleasing, or like you said before, trying to do something, and then eventually the resentment builds so much. Yeah. It's like, I'm always trying to do things for you, and I'm always doing this, and the other person going, but I don't ask you to do that. Yeah. And so how that,
totally. And resentment comes up when our own boundaries get crossed.
Yeah.
Right. And then we project the resentment, but really what's happening is we're resentful for ourselves for allowing our own boundaries to get crossed.
Yeah.
And if we actually were clearer in understanding what our own boundaries are, and clearer in being able to communicate that was my boundary right there, and you've kind of just stepped over it. So if you don't mind, can you just step back?
Yes.
Right?
Yeah.
Then we can, but what happens is we allow people to take 10 steps over, and internally we get angrier and angrier and angrier until there's this explosive reaction of resentment that's projected at the other person because we didn't speak up. We didn't own our truth, right? We didn't speak our truth. No. It always comes back to that. Yeah. And then the moment that you feel that, or you sidestep away from your intuition, and I've spoken about this before on these podcast chats, is that, Drew and I have had conflict, and he's like, I should have said something before because I felt like this was going to end up in an argument. And it's true. Like, that's the thing, like, sometimes we don't know that our boundary's been crossed, but we can feel something doesn't feel right.
Yes.
And then when we're not honouring our feelings, and this is where, again, it comes down to the guys, it's not that guys don't feel. Yeah. It's that we're taught to continue on whether we feel it or not. Yeah. Right? And that is the man's way, just suck it up, princess, and keep going. Yeah. Right? Whereas really, if we're able to, because, we're not in an environment anymore where we do need to suck it up. We actually can honour what's happening inside our body and still function really well in the world, right? Yeah. And it's finding that balance of saying, this is good for me, this isn't good for me, and I'm going to choose what actually is then going to provide us all the best outcome, because we're all going to be in a happier space.
And so I've loved our chat. And so if there's any listeners out there who this is resonating with, like, what's the best way that they can contact you directly?
Yeah, so I've got a Facebook page called Alchemy of Love. That's the easiest place, and there's some events and things like that I run that are on that page as well.
Yeah. And your email address, okay if I give that out?
Sure.
So your email address, jasonbart618@gmail.com, is that right?
Yeah, correct.
And so, if there's anyone listening and this is resonating, I really encourage you to touch base with Jason and find out, explore. It never hurts to ask the question, right? Don't you think? Just 100%. Ask a question and find out and connect with other people. And so did you have anything else to kind of add?
I just want to say to all of the guys that you are not alone, right? That trust me, there are men that feel exactly the same way. And just if there are brothers around you that need to be heard, just hear them out. And don't try and coach them. Don't try and do anything. Just say to a brother, I hear you, man.
Yes, just hold that space, right?
Yeah.
Hold the space. I think that's actually the number one thing, is like not having to solve the problem.
Yeah.
Is just to be there for people. Well, thank you so much for coming on, and I'm sure this is going to be the first of many chats, because I feel like we have so many things that we need to address and we can chat about. So I'm sure I'm going to see you again.
I'd love that.
And one of the things I would love to chat with you about was women and trauma releasing, because I know that's on your expertise, one of your things. I know today is purely about the men, so I don't want to take away or detract from that, but I would love to get you back and talk about that as well.
Great.
All right.
Until then.
Awesome. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for listening, and I'll catch you next time. See you later.
The information, views and opinions expressed on this podcast should not be used or treated as a substitute for nutritional, medical, psychological or other advice by a qualified medical health professional. Hosts and guests on the podcast express their own opinions, experiences and conclusions, and nothing on the podcast should be used to diagnose, treat, cure or prevent any medical conditions. The podcast is not intended to replace any medical or mental health treatment. All information and advice provided is for general well-being and does not take individual cases into consideration. Neither Tracy Saltis, guests on the podcast, or any sponsors endorse the opinions, views or conclusions expressed or shared on the podcast. Tracy Saltis takes no responsibility for any symptoms or consequences as a direct or indirect result of this podcast.